Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger of bloggingforjobs.com, for a 45-minute in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, here's your host, Jessica, with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology podcast. It's great to have you on our new podcast as part of the Blogging for Jobs and Recruiters Lounge blog family. Employment branding is a hot topic in the HR and recruitment industry right now, especially as we are formulating our 2015 recruitment strategies. The concept of employment branding is the strategy and actions behind influencing internal and external perceptions and amplifying the EVP, or employment branding proposition. That is a mouthful. It's a long-term strategy that needs to be tied to applicant quality and employee retention. We're going to be demystifying some of these terms and talking all about employment branding during the podcast. My guest today is Bridget Webb. She's someone who knows more than a bit about employment branding and the steps in building a successful one. Welcome, Bridget, to the Workology podcast.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit more about you and your background.
Well, first, I would like to thank you, Jessica, for having me here today, and to all those out there that are listening. I started my career in HR much like many people. I fell into it. 11 or more years ago, I started as a first employee of a now global RPO company and held many hats while I was with Wilson HCG. Everything from sourcing manager to head of marketing, recruitment technology, and even global growth strategy lead. My experience also spans over head of marketing for a Silicon Valley-based HR technology company. Along the way, I've touched numerous employer brand strategies from mid-sized, high-growth organizations to Fortune 100 companies. I guess you could say employment branding has always been a passion of mine.
And so truly, you were working in the employment branding space before employment branding was a thing.
Yeah, employment branding's really only been talked about, I would say, for probably 5 to 6 years, but it's been around forever. As long as you've had employees, you've had an employment brand.
And that's sometimes a hard thing for managers or business leaders or the C-suite to understand, is that people are talking about your brand, whether or not you are listening. And that is really kind of the basis of employment branding.
Right. Absolutely.
As I mentioned, today's topic is about employment branding. I shared my official definition of employment branding, but I wanted to ask you, Bridget, if there was anything I might have missed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, just as we just discussed, that organizations and HR professionals understand that an employer brand is completely different than employment branding. An organization already has an employment brand. It's already been identified by its current and past employees, along with candidates that interact with the organization. There's already a perception in place of who you are as an employer, who you are as an organization, either good or bad. Employer branding is where marketing and HR collide, I guess you could say. It's all about the actions, the messaging, and so on that help influence this particular perception.
We have a lot of good resources about employer branding and employment branding on Blogging for Jobs, and I'll list some of the links in the bottom of the post that is attached to this podcast. But if you just go to bloggingforjobs.com and go to the right-hand search bar, just put employment branding in, and we have lots of good information for you, even a recent webinar in our learning management system. Can you explain to us, Bridget, what an EVP or an employment value proposition is?
Happy to. An EVP is closely related to one's employment brand. In its simplest form, it's an organization's offer as an employer. It goes beyond the financial gain of, going to work at an organization. It's the benefits and anything else that employees brag about, maybe like over Thanksgiving dinner, holiday dinners. A strong EVP can include things like working with purpose, collaborative environment, flexible hours, or even access to a company gym. It's all of these things that help craft the message in attracting and retaining employees.
I wanted to make sure that we kind of talked a little bit about these definitions because, as we mentioned earlier, that the topic of employment branding, while it's been around since you've had employees and like the dawn of the workplace, it's still something that is a relatively new concept. So just kind of creating a little bit of foundation as maybe you go out and are looking at your recruitment strategy, and maybe one of your recruiting team or somebody says, hey, I read about this thing called employment branding. So now you are informed. How does one set out to create an employment brand for a company? Where do you start?
I think creating employment brand strategy, regardless of the size or the global footprint of an organization, it all really starts with its people. It's asking questions and listening. The more conversations you have, the better understanding, and the more likely you are to be prepared in delivering a meaningful and authentic message that attracts the talent that you're wanting, while painting a clear enough picture that candidates who don't fit your company culture will opt out during the application process. I think that's something that sometimes is overlooked. In asking the same questions over and over to a broad group of employees or across functions and even seniority level, you'll begin to uncover, if you will, your company's EVP. You'll start seeing what it means to work not just at your organization, but in departments. All of this helps with your messaging, all the way down to crafting, the perfect job description. I usually start with a combination of the following. Why did you join the company? What keeps you here? Why do you enjoy working at the organization? And what about your immediate team do you like the best? Or what outcomes do you want from your particular work that you do here?
I just want to point out to folks who are listening to the podcast that we are focused on asking employees. So this isn't something that an organization just, hey, I'm going to be an employer of choice, and we have, as the CEO, I think that we offer flexible scheduling. Well, maybe for the CEO, you can come and go as you please, but for the rest of the employees in your call centers or other various locations, they have to be at the workplace at 8 a.m. So you really need to focus and start by asking your employees, which it isn't always good stuff, I think, and that's the scary part for folks. They don't always hear good things.
Right. But that's just an area to, improve on.
Agreed. And I think it's also important for us just to mention that the bad things aren't always bad. As I see those as opportunities, opportunities to be able to make an impact or to drive change or just to be aware, because chances are if they're saying it in your organization, they're saying it outside. And if we can cut it off at the pass and make a change before they post it on a review site like Glassdoor or other places, I think that's really important. What are your thoughts there?
Couldn't agree more. Definitely couldn't agree more. Candidates are talking. There's social media, so they're out there saying things. So are your employees.
Yes, so it's customers, candidates, whoever it is, employees. They're all having conversations online, and we can monitor with different tools and resources to see what's being said. But the best place to go is directly to the source, and that's just talk openly with your employee population. A recent research from CEB shared that 80% of candidates seek information about a potential employer from an outside source, and that 45% of employees admit not being completely honest about their experience with an employer. Now, I'll have this link over on the podcast, and you can just go ahead and put in blogging for jobs and put in the employment branding strategies, and we'll link directly to that stat for you. So in light of the CEB stat, 80% of candidates seek information from a potential employer from outside sources. So they're going outside of maybe your candidate site or your careers page. And now 45% of employees are admitting that they might not have been completely honest about their experience with your organization. So what can we do as employers, if anything, to help fix this problem? Because it sounds like people aren't being completely honest with their experience. Maybe they're saying it is worse than it actually is. How do we help, or what do we do to help the sharing of accurate resources and information to candidates as well as employees, especially online?
Love this question. As we mentioned, so many organizations out there are just avoiding it, which is probably the biggest no-no that you could make. I guess the first step, towards addressing this is just acknowledging that people are talking. With the introduction of social media and, both candidates and employees having a voice now, they're checking things out on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Glassdoor, as we mentioned. They're looking for what it means to work at your company. Reviews on Glassdoor to me are kind of like reviews on Angie's List. That some are just planted there by the employer themselves. They're just trying to improve their ratings. So I found that visual communication goes a lot further in showcasing your company's culture. And you're able to do so with very little spend. I'm talking about things like photos, videos. Give your employees the ability to share them. Start your own hashtag. Get your employees engaged. This visual communication will showcase what it means to work at your company in the most authentic way possible. And I think that's really what candidates are looking for. They're not looking for some, slick marketing message. They're looking for what it means to work at your organization.
And the best people to hear that from are the actual employees.
Yes.
there's some good hashtags out there right now. One of my favorites, and I talked about this on the webinar that we did recently, was Adobe Life. They have a great hashtag. There's a hashtag Team Amtrak, and they're out there allowing their employees to just share what it's like working at their organization. And then the marketing, communication, and the HR teams are also creating graphics and visuals, like you're recommending videos and things like that, to kind of support the conversation. But really, for the most part, it's an organic conversation that's happening voluntarily. We're not paying these employees anymore or requiring them to take a selfie in front of, the Google offices or wherever they work.
Right. Well, I think it's also a place where if you have a candidate on the phone and you're a recruiter, you can say, hey, go to Tagboard and check us out. Just don't take my word for it. Go see what our employees are saying.
So let's back up. Explain to everybody who's listening on the podcast what Tagboard is.
Tagboard. It's a way to count your hashtags, if you will. So if you go to tagboard.com and you can type in any of these that we're talking about, Adobe Life or anything along those lines, you'll see all the different pictures that are popping up, all the communication, if you will, that's popping up around that particular hashtag. And it's just a great way to get insight into your organization.
Great. And that's a good resource too, like specifically just for hashtags and the surrounding information. We like to share tools and resources for folks as they're listening and provide them for some further explanation. We'll put a link to Tagboard and some information on the post that's related to this podcast as well. With the need to get employees involved, as we've talked about, and so much technology, it's a little overwhelming even for me sometimes. In today's marketplace, especially surrounding talent acquisition, are there a few items or technologies or things that you recommend for employment branding execution, Bridget?
Absolutely, Jessica. You know that I love HR technology, and you also know that not all technology is created equal or even needed. However, even with that being said, there are a few that I wholeheartedly believe make executing an employment brand strategy easier and smarter. Just look at Q Social, for instance. They give companies, even with the most complicated social media policies, which I hate, the place and the ability to push shareable content out to their employees and their employees' network. A company's employees are their loudest and best brand ambassadors, as you and I have already said. Q Social is making building brand ambassador programs so much easier with the insight and analytics to see what is working and who has the largest reach. They're allowing you to amplify your brand messaging like never before. Another one that I love is Recruitix. They have taken the guessing out of your PPP spend. They're optimizing organizations' Indeed and other PPP spend in a way that they are saving tens of thousands of dollars for organizations. It's like Google AdWords on steroids for talent acquisition. Those two I absolutely love.
All right, so let's back up a little bit because I know that folks are going to be like, what? Social? So it's QUESOCIAL, Q Social. And then Recruitix is just Recruit. ICS. Now, explain to us what PPC is in case that we aren't aware.
Okay, think of it as Google AdWords pay-per-click advertising. A lot of organizations out there are now using Indeed, and it's usually being functioned, if you will, from your talent acquisition department. Not everybody there is going to be a guru when it comes to PPC and how to optimize your spend and what's working and what's not working. So they've really taken the guessing game out of it. There are a bunch of ex-Google execs, if you will, that have taken that algorithm and used it now for talent acquisition. So they're going to organizations and saying, hey, guess what? That job posting is not going to get you what you need to use. Go look at the job description. Or, hey, you've now filled this particular one. You know that it takes 30 applications, to fill your role. We've now done that. Let's go ahead and take your spend and shift it over to another opening.
And I think that's so smart. And this is an example too. The Q Social and Recruitix are examples of how marketing is infiltrating human resources.
Yes. Absolutely.
Because these are traditional, maybe PR agency or marketing functions that are now moving into the talent acquisition space.
Correct.
So let's take a little bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic, and it's been a fun one so far, is about employment branding with my guest, Bridget Webb. And you can connect with Bridget on Twitter if you so choose, and it's at Webb_Bridget. That's WEBB_BRIDGET. So follow her on Twitter. tweet her, let her know that you're listening. She's got a lot of really good resources and information. Bridget, you seem to be writing a lot of different places. You want to tell us about kind of where you're spending your time these days on the blogosphere?
Absolutely. Obvious with you guys, with Be a Leader, done so on recruiting blogs. I have a few others that are going to be coming out. I love all things HR technology and all things employment branding. So that's really what I'm focusing a lot of my attention on lately. And it's been a great deal of fun.
I think a lot of companies and talent acquisition folks are thinking about these areas. I've mentioned before in previous podcasts that the HR technology industry is just exploding. This year alone, $15 billion are going to be spent by folks in talent acquisition and human resources who are going to be purchasing technology to help them do their jobs every day and just to make the workplace and the process and what we do easier. But employment branding is an area that's growing. It's interesting as I've seen it evolved. One of our first Workology podcasts, actually it was our first, we had the wonderful Jason Seiden on, and he talked about employment branding as well. It's a topic that I think, hence why we're here, that deserves more conversation from practitioners like you who are in the weeds and currently building and executing strategies. It's one thing to have somebody on, and not to knock Jason. Jason's worked in a lot of different areas, but he's kind of looking at more from a consultant level. And then you have a lot of these technology companies who were talking about employment branding, but they're taking it from a technology standpoint. So Bridget comes in and kind of offers us this practitioner point of view, which I think is so important. Jason on the podcast talked about Edelman's Trust Barometer, and we'll have a link on the post for you, and the 16 qualities that marketers use when building relationships and trust with a consumer. The 4 major in the Edelman Trust Barometer are engagement, integrity, products, and operations. So I wanted to ask you, Bridget, what's the most important factor for you when it comes to building an employment branding strategy? I listed kind of the 4 major ones here. Are any of those something that you might think are important?
All those are important. Don't get me wrong. But I think that when you're building an employment brand strategy, it really starts with 2 major things. And I think that's kind of like the jumping off point. That's going to be your messaging and buy-in. Because as for your messaging, whenever you're starting to do this, you need to ask yourself a few questions. Is it real? Is your messaging consistent? Is it bold enough to stand out? Because if it's not, you need to scratch it and start over. And the same thing with buy-in. Is senior leadership invested? Does your CEO even know that you're trying to attempt to build an employment brand strategy, and is he on board? Because without this, no strategy will ever be successful.
Do you think that these 2 that you mentioned, messaging and buy-in, which I think are great, by the way, this is where HR and maybe employment branding differentiates itself from marketing a little bit?
Yes, because yes, you have HR and yes, you have marketing, but you have this thing in HR called process and talent acquisition and employee engagement, which doesn't really generally exist in just your day-to-day marketing function. So I think that you kind of have to have a know-how of both whenever you're starting to build out your employment brand.
Awesome. Well, I have linked to the Edelman Trust Barometer for listeners, as I mentioned, on the blog. So just visit bloggingforjobs.com and enter in Bridget Webb, that's with 2 B's, into the right-hand search bar to be connected to the podcast and the links and the resources that we've mentioned today on the Workology podcast. Do you think that employment branding needs to be managed by talent acquisition or marketing? I ask this question because there's a huge debate about this. Who needs to own this, and why should one community or department own employment branding more than another?
Right. And yes, you're right. Everybody's talking about it. I personally think that employment branding can sit in either. However, I think cross-functional involvement is an absolute must, or you're going to have absolute failure. HR needs marketing's know-how when it comes to creative, SEO, SEM, to name just a few. And marketing needs HR when it comes to recruitment process, employee and candidate data, and so on. Without involvement from both sides, it really becomes a much harder uphill battle, and it doesn't really need to be.
So I was at the LinkedIn Talent Connect conference in San Francisco earlier or later in 2014, and I got to hear a lot of really great presentations and talks and met some wonderful people. And one of the questions that kept coming up in all the employment branding sessions, at least one person asked, how do I, this is an HR person maybe asking this question, how do I get a conversation with marketing. Maybe they're really siloed. They don't want to talk to me. How can talent acquisition folks be able to bridge that gap and start building a relationship with marketing? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I had this come up a few times in my career, I guess you could say. If you're speaking, for instance, just of LinkedIn, as we know, LinkedIn is a powerhouse when it comes to marketing, whether it be your consumer marketing or whether it be your talent marketing. If you, as a talent acquisition professional, can show how this affects your company's bottom line, because your employment brand, if you will, can affect your company's bottom line. If you can connect those two and go in and show them and show them a tool in which you're both able to share it, like LinkedIn, I think that's how you're going to get them involved.
I agree. And, it's interesting as I've watched a lot of folks who have made the transition in the employment branding space. One of my favorites is Avery Bach, and she is over at Taco Bell. And for a year or so, she went to regular meetings and kind of had to force herself into the marketing meetings as a member of the recruiting team, and just kind of inserting herself into conversations. She wasn't like overbearing, but just being present, and then, sharing resources and information as she was available, and then really started building that trust factor and that credibility.
Yeah, trust is definitely one that you have to gain. And I think it's important for any department, regardless of who you're going to, whether it's marketing or HR, if you can show them that you need me as much as I need you. Because at the end of the day, that marketing department, they're still going to need great marketing talent coming through the door. So if you're able to say, hey, help me create this message, help me attract the right talent that you need for your team, I think you're going to be able to get buy-in from them a lot quicker.
I also think that the easy way, or I'm saying easy, but another, I guess, way to kind of make the sale, right, that marketing and HR can work together is saying, hey, marketing, let me help you with your campaigns. Let's align our efforts. I have XYZ channels. We can do this. We can do that. I can share on Twitter. I can help drive eyeballs to your campaign. And then hopefully you've built this great maybe Twitter following or Instagram or Pinterest or whatever your channel is, that you can demonstrate value. They're like, wow, how did you do that? And then you guys can kind of start the conversation from there.
Exactly.
Another question I wanted to ask you is, so let's talk a little bit about ROI. And I know this question isn't on the script, so and that's okay. But I've been thinking a lot about this because I've heard a number of people speak on employment branding, and like you, I do a lot of writing and reading and just talking about all things topics related to marketing and HR. How does someone what do they need to do to be able to measure a success of maybe an employment branding campaign? Are there certain metrics or things they need to look at?
I think there's metrics that are being measured today just because it's easy to pull out of your ATS. But I think there's a variety of different things just from a very fundamental that you can look at. And I know this is a conversation that you and I have had time and time again. You can first start by how much more traffic are you driving to your career site, right? But at the end of the day, we both know that we're looking for quality applicants, not just applicants. So if you're delivering the right message and enough of a story about what it's really like to work at your organization, your applicants might actually decrease, but those are going to be quality applicants. So I think you measure both quality applicants, and that can be different per organization, whether it be, they made it to a phone interview or they made it to a face-to-face, and just the number of the increase in traffic to your site itself. I think that's something else that you can measure. As far as quality hires, I think that's another that you can look at from a retention rate, depending on your organization. Maybe you start with just one particular cross function like sales or something along those lines, the quick quit, or how quickly are they able to actually start to get up and going. Yes, a lot of that has to do with the onboarding, but I think employment branding is part of onboarding. So those are just a few areas that you can look at that aren't the norm.
I love the idea of maybe having your pilot program, or as Stacey Chapman, who's been a guest on the podcast, has said before, lighthouse. She doesn't call it a pilot. She calls it a lighthouse. Using your lighthouse program and using employment branding for sales first, because you can directly relate their success to targets that they're expected to meet.
Absolutely.
And I love that. Now, I was kind of surprised that when you gave this answer to me, I guess not, but people might be surprised. You didn't mention anything about the number of Twitter followers or hashtag impressions or any of those things. Why?
Yes, social media is important, I guess you could say, and that is something that you can measure. But right now, I don't think anybody is doing it correctly as far as how you're measuring your social media with employee engagement or talent acquisition to what that means to your business's bottom line. Yes, it's important and it lets you know that you're doing something right. You're gaining traction in the social world, but how is it affecting your bottom line? I don't think that connection's been made yet.
I agree. And I wanted to point that out because I think that we're really quick to go with, we had 50 million Twitter impressions over 6 months for this campaign. But at the end of the day, how many good quality applicants or candidates did that lead to? And oftentimes in employment branding or just talent acquisition in general, we aren't doing really important things like looking at Google Analytics to look at traffic like you mentioned, and maybe we still have the self-select drop-down menu on the applicant tracking system, which says, how did you hear about us?
Right.
And that's crazy. Yeah.
That's not going to be accurate.
No, absolutely not. And so are there any other maybe suggestions that you can make for somebody who is trying to quantify or those sort of things like source of hire and how employment branding impacts the success of their talent acquisition?
Well, there is one thing that you mentioned, and yes, I know we're talking about talent acquisition, but when I look at it, I don't just think about the attraction piece and the hire. I think about it also from an employee engagement piece or retention piece, because as I've said before, I think on another webinar, your employee is somebody else's candidate. If you can look at it from, is your employee engagement boosted? Yes, that might not necessarily be your bottom line, but that's churn that you're not having to replace. I think that's another way that you can look at the social media aspect of employer branding. And how that affects your organization.
The retention piece and the engagement piece, anytime I've ever done the annual employee engagement survey that we all love, I've tried to treat it like a marketing campaign. And so reminding employees over the course of maybe a quarter before the campaign, the different things that we've done throughout the year that we've listened to them and that we are helping to maybe drive communication or leadership or different areas of opportunity in the previous survey that had been identified. Oftentimes employees are new within that year, so they didn't participate in the survey from the previous year and they don't even know what we were working on. So if we can tie engagement directly to our employment branding activities, that's, I think, a really fabulous thing. And it definitely doesn't hurt because we're supporting our communication efforts. And everybody needs to be reminded from time to time, what's happening and maybe why the HR team or line managers, worked on a particular program.
Absolutely.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Bridget, for joining the Workology podcast. Is there any way that people can connect with you outside of Twitter?
LinkedIn. I am always on LinkedIn, day and night. So definitely connect with me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. So we'll put the link for Bridget, but like I said, if you just Google Bridget Webb, it just should pop up on the top of your screen there in the Googles. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast. Thanks for listening in. We discussed the science and art of the workplace here, involving HR and recruitment. Until next time, you can visit Blogging for Jobs and listen to all our past episodes. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Jessica.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill, provided by Total Picture Media.